Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha talks with the Reverend Dr. William Harrison. Bill is president of Lutheran Theological Seminary, Saskatoon, and chair of the Saskatoon Theological Union Common Faculty. Bill teaches systematic theology and historical theology and ethics. In addition to his PhD in systematic theology and church history from Boston College, Bill has degrees in English literature, theology, and political science. Bill's the author of Leadership in a Shrinking Church, Frequently Asked Questions in Christian Theology, and In Praise of Mixed Religions. Everywhere he goes, Bill takes music with him, listening to a broad variety. And at home, he spends as much time as possible walking trails or out in his kayak. As a reminder, before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. You can connect with Lauren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram, and we appreciate your voice and how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm your host for today's episode, Martha Tatarnic, and I'm really happy today to be joined by the Reverend Dr. Bill Harrison. Welcome, Bill. It's so great to have you on our program.
Thank you so much, Martha. It's great to be here.
Great. So we have a really interesting conversation ahead of us, but we always, like to give a little context to our listeners for who is speaking and where they're coming from and what they're saying. So maybe, Bill, you can just start us off by sharing a little bit about your faith journey, what it has looked like in the past and what it looks like now.
Sure. So I'd say it's a journey into greater and greater complexity. One of my little kind of self-description things that I used in a sermon once and then it stuck was that I've become the complexity fly. I fly around saying, it's always more complicated than that. I actually grew up in a fundamentalist context. And that, it had a fairly clear, fairly simple sense of what Christianity is all about. And for me, that really fell apart when I became an undergraduate and, did a whole variety of reading, started tackling more complex and interesting questions that kind of went beyond the community in which I grew up. That's actually when I became an Anglican, which is, I guess what I officially am. And for me, that shift was, in large part about being able to hear and hold, a variety of different voices. Since then, I've done a whole bunch of ecumenical work so that, I feel very comfortable in a whole variety of Christian contexts. I've spent 12 years as co-chair of the Anglican United Dialogue here in Canada. Now 8 years as president of a Lutheran seminary. I'm really involved with the Association of Theological Schools, which means that, I could find myself, visiting a Roman Catholic seminary, a Presbyterian seminary. In fact, a bunch of my theological education was actually in a Roman Catholic context. So I've kind of encountered a lot of Christianities and done some thinking about interreligious relationships. So I would say that my Christianity now is it's complex and it expects complex questions and it's about a lot of openness and about a lot of listening, which doesn't mean, don't come to conclusions, but it means try not to jump to them. And try to be attentive to what people are saying and attentive to the different ways in which people encounter God.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that sort of leaning into the complexity, and I can imagine that would have been an important place to find some freedom and a home, as you were sort of finding one version of Christianity falling apart, and looking for something else. I think it can be the great gift and the great frustration of our particular form of Christianity is sometimes just how much we lean into the complexity, but would we really want it any different?
Yeah, well, and that's the challenge, right? I mean, one of the challenges that I think we'll be talking about is kind of communicating the good news, and that's a whole lot more complicated when you just started out by assuming that Christianity is pretty complicated and the world's pretty complicated, right? Because it doesn't lend itself to the quick and easy answer, the 4 spiritual laws or whatever. I mean, that's all just, it starts out as an oversimplification and takes you. So when you start out with the idea that it's all pretty complicated and that God works in different and interesting ways with different people, it becomes a different kind of way of being. But I think it's a richer and more satisfying one for me.
Yeah, for sure. I also like, as you're naming those voyages across different Christian contexts, I often like to sort of note the different Christian dialects that we have. Like, there are just different ways of talking that we have in our expressions, and it's good to have some fluency in understanding those different dialects, I think. So you must be pretty fluent.
I do have the feeling of being pretty multilingual in Christianity. I do have this sense that I can walk into a whole variety of Christian contexts and have a sense of what people are really getting at with the different languages that people use. So, but it's always a journey too, because, natives in any language always use, it with a kind of subtlety that those of us who are learning different languages as we go, need always to be attentive to.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So in all of that, traveling across the Christian landscape and serving in a variety of contexts, is there a spiritual practice that you're finding particularly meaningful right now that you might want to share with our listeners?
Sure. I'm actually going to cheat and toss a couple at you. One of them is actually just my writing, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. My writing is probably my most important spiritual practice. That's when I really try to come to grips with what God is saying to me. That, for me, that's when I sit down and say, okay, what is this for real? And that's when I spot the vagaries, the fuzzy bits, the pieces of data that I may be leaving out. That's kind of when there's a certain amount of kind of rubber hits the road when I actually sit down to write it. But that's also balanced, I'm going to say, by as much time as I can manage in my kayak out on the lake. I'm deeply, deeply blessed. We have a condo on a small lake in British Columbia, and basically between March and November, I get out every day that I can, and I find that it's very meditative. I have always been able to see God at work in and behind the created order. And so just being out in the kayak, it's remarkable how many unimportant things start to fall away, and how much I have a sense of God's presence with me, and of being able to hear God.
Beautiful. I really relate to those two spiritual practices. I mean, for me, it's running rather than kayaking, but like you, writing is a really powerful spiritual practice for me. And I think in both cases, both cases are just such an experience of grace as well. Like it's always amazing to me to read back my writing and feel like there's this real partnership that I get to be part of, like that it's not just me who's doing this, like it's the real receiving of that relationship. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's we have lots of people listening to the show serving in different contexts across the church, and we're always all looking for kind of those practical ways that we grow and are healthy in our relationship with God. So thank you. So as I teased at the beginning, we have a really interesting topic to get into today, and that is your newly published book, which is called Leadership in a Shrinking Church, Finding New Vision in Unlikely Places. I have lots to reflect on and have been reflecting on in reading it, but this is about you. So why don't you start by telling us a bit about the context in which you serve, which is a pretty big player, I would say, in how this book came about. So maybe you can just talk about that, what you were seeing and what prompted you to write this book.
Sure, yeah. And in fact, I begin the book with a bit of a story about arriving where I am. I'm at Lutheran Theological Seminary based in Saskatoon and serving the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, predominantly across Western Canada. So I arrived at LTS back in 2017, and I'm the president there. And I realized that we faced some challenges. Nothing was quite working. The whole system was a bit troubled. People were at odds. It was kind of an unsettling experience. And the interesting thing is that everyone was locating the problem in a different place. So I would hear from sort of different people, yeah, we've got a problem. Here's where it is. Yeah, we've got a problem. Here's where it is. Thing is that most of the challenges that people were naming were real, but they didn't seem like the challenge. They felt like challenges. And as I examined the situation, I realized that none of them were actually the problem. The problem was that the seminary had become small and the system didn't know it yet. What had happened was that over time, it had, shrunk a bit here, shrunk a bit there, shrunk a bit here, shrunk a bit there. And even as it got smaller here and there, it didn't necessarily kind of get smaller in its sense of what it was supposed to do or where it was supposed to do it or even really how it was supposed to do it. So basically my shift was to say, okay, this institution has gotten smaller. What do they train us to do when an institution is getting smaller? Actually, the answer is they don't train us.
Yeah, that's right.
To institutions getting smaller. In our world, getting smaller is mostly seen as failure.
Yes.
So nobody prepares us for it, right?
Truly. Yeah.
And so that's kind of what launched the book. It was sort of, okay, we've got to start thinking about leadership in this situation in which getting smaller is a reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Because everything that you're describing in the seminary is absolutely paralleled in the experience of congregations and other forms of Christian ministry right across the board. So, although I don't serve in a seminary, reading the opening of your book felt exceptionally relatable. Like, that is the situation. And you're right. Like, we are not prepared for it because shrinking is failing. And that really leads me into my next question, which is, like, we interview a lot of people on The Future Christian. For example, like Lauren just released an episode this week, I think, looking at Robert Schuller's biography, which is called The Church Must Grow or Perish. Like, that's not just the title of Robert Schuller's attitude. Like that is the title of the axe that is hanging over all of our heads a lot of the time. That's what it feels like. So, like, this doesn't come from nowhere. Obviously, like, everybody likes to grow and succeed and feel like we're flourishing in obvious and measurable ways. But that idea of numerical growth is also just like incredibly like layered into the DNA of what we think we're supposed to be doing as Christians. And I know a lot of the people that we talk to on this podcast would like fully subscribe to the notion that numerical growth is what we're supposed to be doing because we are supposed to be sharing the gospel, the good news. And if you are sharing the gospel, then you will be growing. Now you like really take to task that numerical growth model right at the outset. So why don't you take it to task right here?
So, okay, absolutely. I mean, you're right. And of course, I mean, there is a growth thing that's, part of modernity and whatnot. But there is also a deeper narrative that it's just there in Christianity pretty much from the beginning. If you look in the book of Acts, it's, the text is punctuated with references to many people, sometimes
thousands.
Yeah,
thousands in a day.
Yeah, and that day 3,000 were added, and that day 5,000. It's that kind of numbers thing, and there's a sense that this is good news, and everybody's going to flock to it. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that's kind of part of, as you say, our DNA. And there are parts of the world where Christianity is seeing numerical growth, but in what I call the Anglosphere. Australasia, Canada, the UK, the US, we're seeing numerical decline overall, have been for quite some time, and it's pretty substantial. So I'd like to jump in and emphasize two things as people think about this. The first is that people just actually aren't joining voluntary organizations at all. This is just about church. This is they're not joining the Lions Club, the Knights of Pythias, the Sweet Adelines, you name it. And it's true throughout the
scouting movement, the local bands, like all of the things.
Political parties, you name it. Even ones where historically it's been a moneymaker for people to join the organization, they're not. And even when people will join the professional organizations, they're not jumping in a voluntary sort of way, in the way that they once did. Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone. It came out back in 2000 and was reissued in 2020. And he pointed this out. And now there are all sorts of things to critique about Putnam's argument, but nobody disagrees with his basic point, which is that voluntary organizations are shrinking. So making the assumption that getting church right is going to add members ends up being just laying out an unrealistic assumption. It gets the sociology wrong. My concern that may be even a deeper one is that I actually think there's a theological problem with the way we go at it too. When we focus on numbers, we tend to emphasize one decision. Now, that decision differs depending on who you are and where you are in church. It might be the choice to attend church. It might be the choice to be baptized. It might be, you might use the language of committing your life to Christ. But it tends to be, you've got to make this decision to do this. And so, you'll be in church and we'll all be happy our churches are growing, etc. I would argue that it's a theological and a practical failure. John Bowen uses an analogy. He describes it a bit as being a bit like someone moving from 49 to 50 on a 100-point scale. That's not a great analogy. It's got its limits, but it's a helpful reminder that you're only talking about a relatively small proportion of what it is to be Christian. And from where I sit, Christian formation is about more than just one decision. Christian participation in God's transformation of the world is about far more than one decision. And so if we're preaching for numbers, then we probably aren't really sharing the good news in its fullness, and we might not be sharing it for the right reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that right reasons piece is really important as well. And, I guess I would just add to that, like, so much of the experience of that axe hanging over our heads, like grow or perish, it ends up being about competition and just competing for a smaller and smaller piece of the pie. And that doesn't feel particularly gospel oriented either, to be honest.
Yeah, in some of the work that I've done in the past, one of the things I've noticed is that when you see a congregation in an area in a city growing fairly rapidly, usually what you see is something of a dip in the attendance in the congregation surrounding it. There are probably some added new members to the church, but commonly what you're doing is seeing what sometimes people call circulation of the saints. They're just moving because, I don't know, there's a new exciting clergy person, or there's just more going on in that congregation, or whatever.
Better coffee.
Better coffee.
Bigger parking lot.
Yeah. Somehow they're sort of thriving at that moment, but it mostly isn't changing the actual dynamic of the church or its contribution to God's transformation of the world.
No, you're definitely not arguing in all of that the gospel doesn't matter, that sharing the gospel doesn't matter. So what is it why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you reframe that model, and specifically around transformation?
Okay. So that word complex that I began with, that one comes right back at us here, because I actually argue that the transformation that we want to see in ourselves, want to see in the church, want to see in the world, the transformation that God is working in the world, is actually much more complex than we tend to make it sound. And so I actually lean on a Canadian Jesuit theologian and philosopher, Bernard Lonergan, and argue that there are actually 4 aspects of transformation that we're wise to attend to, that we would like to see in ourselves, and that we really want to see in the world, that really are about what God is doing in the world. And so those 4 kinds of transformation are intellectual, psychic, moral, and religious. And I think it's kind of interesting that religious comes last in the list. And I'll say why in a moment. But intellectual transformation is actually about learning to ask and answer the relevant questions. And that means asking questions about things that we don't necessarily want to ask about, and incorporating data that we don't necessarily want to incorporate. And seriously checking our own work so that we can really honestly say, yeah, we really did ask and answer the relevant questions before we came to a conclusion. We like to jump to conclusions, and we see a lot of that in our contemporary world where you get the conclusion that you wanted, and the results can really be pretty destructive. And I would argue that you can't base a Christianity on dishonesty. It's got to be based on a real transformation there. But the mind isn't all that we are, right? There's also psychic transformation that pays attention to our emotions, to our kind of internal symbolic lives, finding ways that we work emotionally so that we can understand how that has an impact on the people around us, has an impact on the world, has an impact on our own thinking and understanding. And moral transformation is about paying attention, yes, to our intellectual and our psychic stuff, and the conclusions that come from that, allowing those to have an impact on our decisions about right and wrong, and also being prepared to consider the larger questions that touch others, not just focusing on self-interest. What makes all of that possible is what I would argue is religious transformation. In fact, what Bernard Lonergan argues is the encounter with love that enables us to live in love. It's not true that all you need is love. On the other hand, it is true that you need love, because love is precisely what actually drives you forward to try to understand the world, to try to understand yourself, and to try to do what God would call you to do in the world.
Okay, well, going through those 4 transformations, you can definitely see the appeal of the one and done version of Christianity, where there is just kind of an easy black and white answer. We don't have to think about it too much. But then what you describe is so resonant, I think, with what we really see in our congregations, in our ministries, in not just our ministries in our churches, but how we do attempt to live as Christians in the world. Like, those transformations are descriptive of where we see God at work in our world.
I think they really are. I think those are the kinds of things that we, when we see progress and transformation in ourselves, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And they are often the things that we focus on, when people buy things like self-help books. Those are often the kinds of things that they're seeking to develop. One of the things I would say also is that they are the kinds of transformations that we hope for when we engage with, issues and questions in the contemporary world. And they allow us, when we realize that those are the kinds of things that we're working toward, I think they really help us to figure out, okay, how is my position relating to somebody else's position? Am I being fully open? Am I actually asking and answering all of the relevant questions? Are there emotional issues that are just causing me to have a kind of gut reaction that prevents me from really hearing the person? Mm-hmm. And okay, am I really caring about the world here? Or is this one kind of serving me under the guise of caring for the world? Is it really love in action at the moment, or am I kind of limited by some of these sorts of pieces?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think very simply put, is it actually about attending to the presence and activity of God, or is it about me?
Yes.
Is it about affirming me? And at the end of the day, redefining what a thriving church looks like, I think allows a pretty massive exhale in this time and place.
Yeah. And moving from the me or my in-group or my, my social group, my cultural group. The thing is that's actually where a lot of us are trapped in our churches without even necessarily fully realizing it, because churches are, they have cultural histories, they have linguistic histories, and those can become real, they have been real ways of reaching people and enabling people to connect to God. That's a good thing. But they can also become boundaries and even barriers in relation to other people when other people speak different languages, including different languages about God, when they approach questions differently, when they raise questions that didn't even show up in our framework. And so I see these transformations as ways to cross a lot of those boundaries, cross a lot of those barriers. And yes, it's a complex activity, but hey, actually one of the cool things about humanity is that we're actually equipped for pretty complex kinds of judgments and really complex ways of thinking and being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So when I was reading the book, there was a particular section that really impacted me. It made me feel very seen. I think a lot of people listening to the podcast might feel the same way. I'm just going to read directly from what you've said here because I think it's incredibly important. So you're talking about outlining the history of the role of the pastor, priest, minister. And you say the priorities of presbyters have changed multiple times over the past millennium, which is a good thing. However, the role of presbyters has not generally moved from one model to the next. Instead, presbyters have commonly been expected to keep the old role while adding the new. The result has been a destructive transformation by accumulation, in which the responsibilities of presbyters have increased until they are simply untenable. It has become too big a task for anyone. Do you want to just say a bit more about what that destructive transformation by accumulation looks like? I want you to speak to it, but I think any of us who are serving the church right now could probably put together a pretty compelling paragraph about what that looks like.
Well, yeah. I mean, put bluntly, it really is crushing people in that role. I use the word presbyter. It's based in the Greek. It helps me to avoid all the different terms. But yeah, nearly all churches have people in that role, and they're all feeling the pressure. So what I do in the book is I go back roughly 1,000 years to look at the way that the presbyteral role has developed. And what's happened is that there's just been a succession of priorities of the church that have been reflected in the presbyteral role. And those pieces have just been sort of piled on prior pieces. So, in the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages at least, the priority for presbyters was the sacramental role. It was, baptism, it was the Mass, it was burial, and perhaps especially the Mass. And one of the interesting things about that is that for that sacramental role to connect to people, it also had buildings very visibly connected to it, so that there was an enormous building spree for a significant chunk of what we think of as the High Middle Ages. So you get the sacramental role and the buildings that come with it. And of course, presbyters end up being, some rich people decide they want a building that shows off their community and their riches and everything. And they provide that. And then basically, they walk away and the presbyter kind of has to take care of it. And then, Luther and the Reformation, there's a move to the emphasis on preaching, on proclamation. That does not rule out the sacramental emphasis. That gets added to it. And that in itself, Luther doesn't expect that to be super complicated. He also doesn't expect it to be just the work of a presbyter. But in fact, that's how it develops, in part because we end up with a whole variety of denominations, which again adds more buildings. And we end up with presbyters who then not only have to know so they have a fairly clear sense of what they see the gospel as being about. They've also got to be able to make a whole bunch of distinctions. The average layperson can't distinguish, a Zwinglian reading of the Eucharist from a Lutheran reading from an Anglican reading. Presbyters are supposed to be able to. They're supposed to get this right. So it's a whole kind of intellectual thing and a whole bunch more buildings. And then in the whole modern period, there are a whole bunch of philosophical and theological movements that actually make understanding the gospel and thinking it much more complicated, partly because of the way that we read texts now, which is much more complex activity than it was in like the 16th or 17th century, partly also because of how we think about relating to God. This all got more complicated. And that means So now when a presbyter prepares a sermon, there's a kind of expectation around a whole bunch of commentaries and a whole bunch of kind of thinking that they'll do. And so this kind of sits on top. And then in the 20th century, the whole bunch of professional expectations that emerge. Pastoral care ceases to be just a kind of fairly basic activity that grows out of your theology or grows out of, your personal care. Becomes a highly professionalized activity at which you're highly trained and in which there's a high set of expectations set that's completely formalized and is bounded by a whole bunch of insurance issues and a whole bunch of formal professionalization issues and legal issues. And of course, the 20th century tossed in a whole bunch more buildings with a huge building spree in the post-World War II era. There's also a whole kind of professionalization around management and leadership that presbyters are supposed to be up on. They don't have to have an MBA, but on the other hand, they're supposed to know some things about building management, about human resources management, et cetera, that, once upon a time they didn't have to know. And this all, this all gets piled on them. And then there's the digital shift and suddenly they're supposed to be able to do all this and do it, while connecting to people online and living in the digital world. And it just becomes enormous. It's just not sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, when you go through the list like that, I feel simultaneously a little panicky because I know that list, and affirmed. And I mean, I do want to just say that it is one of the joys of the job is the complexity that you get to continue to be a work in progress. I've legitimately enjoyed learning how social media works to some degree, although my kids still think I'm terrible at it. But I enjoy new challenges. I enjoy figuring things out. I enjoy seeing, spending my days in a whole variety of ways. But I also, and I've been pretty open about this over the years, I also know that hamster wheel that we can get on, and how easy it is to buy into the idea that if I just do more and more and more and keep pedaling as fast as I possibly can, then I'm going to personally save this dying church. And I'm not talking about a specific congregation. I've been able to serve churches that have in many ways experienced growth and flourishing, but that the institutional weight of decline is always with us, and it is so easy in the midst of that enormous job description to take on a Messiah complex and think that really the job is just about doing more and more and more and more. And spoiler alert, it doesn't. There's a limit to that.
Yeah. Well, and you end up with a job that's kind of defined by tasks with 2 on the list of tasks. And yeah, I mean, I would argue that if attendance numbers were rising, the load might have been sort of sustainable, at least in part because, as you say, I mean, there's a certain amount of joy in being able to do a whole variety of things. It's, I've also done parish ministry and it's one of the things I enjoyed about parish ministry. My wife also does parish ministry and it's part of what she enjoys about parish ministry. There are a variety of directions you can go, a variety of things you can do. And there's always this feeling of growing personally as you grow and learn and all great. The problem is that as the church shrinks, there tends to be less financial and human capacity to pick up when the load becomes too much. And it ceases to become I can do these things really well and I can focus on these, and some other people or some other congregations can focus on these different things. And instead, we're all just feeling the stress of there are no longer resources to sustain this, and it ceases to be, you've got the opportunity to do a bunch of things, and becomes you've got the pressure to do a bunch of things. You're supposed to do everything. You're supposed to be pretty good at everything, because if you aren't good at everything, it's not going to work. The church is going to continue to shrink. And there's also this thing about the way that growth tends to help people to forgive presbyters who can't do everything. If numbers are growing, then the fact that the presbyter, might preach really well, might not be so great at presiding, or might do pastoral care really well, but the preaching isn't ideal, or might actually be just, not very good with social media or whatever. There's plenty of room for trying to build around that, and for saying, well, we're growing anyway and it's all doing fine. But when numbers are shrinking, and we've all been trained that success looks like the numerical model, then presbyters personally feel the pressure of all that they're expected to do. And they're also first in line to get blamed for what looks like failure. Everybody wants the young sort of social media, able clergy person that they figure they can get, who can turn the whole thing around. And if you're not that, then you're not that. And it's really completely, missing a point about the work that God's doing in the world. And I would say it's really unhealthy for the church, as well as being really unhealthy for presbyters.
Yeah, and there is a corollary to that as well, which I think is important to name, because we have church leaders of all different kinds of stripes who listen to this podcast and contribute to this podcast, and that accumulation of role can affect people in other parts of ministry in the church as well. I mean, you document it very well in the role of the presbyter, but like the professionalization of church wardens and treasurers and music directors, and like all of those accumulation of tasks, and everybody is holding the bag on like whether our efforts are leading to growth or not. And I think that you do a really good job in the book of describing the ways that anxious systems start to operate when everybody's feeling that pressure point. I have to say, like, I have limited patience for addressing clergy burnout with self-care because, and I mean, I'm a fan of self-care. It's just that self-care doesn't get at the problem, and in fact can feel kind of isolating because it turns it back on the clergy person again. Like, you just need to be better about your day off and maybe get a hobby and stuff like that. But it doesn't address the bigger issues that are leading to the problem. So, like, what do you think the role is across individual congregations? And then I'm really interested in knowing what you think the broader denominational role needs to be in helping to address these realities, unsustainable realities, really.
Right. Well, I mean, my first straight answer at the congregational level, perhaps especially, is frankly, do less with less. I know I have a leadership coach. My leadership coach does not like my phrase, do less with less.
Oh, really?
No.
You use it quite a few times in the book.
Yeah, because more with less is the idea that we have, right?
Yeah.
Function more efficiently, you get more done working, But the reality is that I actually think that it's time for churches to start saying, no, we can't do as much as we would like to do. We just have to recognize it and do less with less. and be really intentional about it, figuring out what you're really about, figuring out how you're going to participate in God's transformation of the world, and focus on that instead of really trying to kind of cover all the bases the way that they used to cover them. And I think that plays into the denominational piece. There are some ways that we're expanding the roles of some lay leaders, and that's a good thing. And, seminaries, for instance, are participating in that broadening of sense of what ministry is and preparing people, and working on programs to extend the skills of presbyters and others in paid accountable ministry. But those are adjustments in a system where the system itself is not really working, and the adjustments aren't going to change the fundamental dynamic. So what do I see happening at the denominational level that's going to matter? I actually think that it's going to be less and less denominational. I actually think that we're reaching a point where the focus on being denominational is not really helpful. And so that's why, one of the chapters in the book is in fact about partnering and fill in some of those details. But it's actually that partnering, that working beyond denominations, indeed working beyond the Christian community, that I think makes sense. I think it's also going to be prepared to be quite supportive of closure of congregations, recognizing that the existing denominational structures just aren't going to make it. So really, it's denominations need to reconcile themselves to a world in which they are smaller and getting smaller. And they'd have to move into different arrangements. I could say in the context where I am, we, as a seminary, moved out of a building that, people really valued, and it was designed and built for us back in the 1960s. And it was, an enormous building, nearly 60,000 square feet. And it just had nothing to do with our contemporary needs, and moved into a smaller space to share with a couple of other denominational schools. And we're doing more to integrate. And it's going to be that kind of experience, I think, across denominations.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And, a big key, I think, in all of this, in parish and on the denominational level, is starting with honesty about what's going on, which I think is super important about your book, like naming the truth and then living into it, instead of trying to pretend it's not happening. Your biggest chapter in the book is devoted to a particular tool that, I don't know, like, did you develop this tool, or is this a specifically Harrisonian tool? Okay.
This is a Harrisonian tool. It's based on all sorts of other things that I've worked with through the years, and it's probably not going to sound wildly different to people. But no, this is a specifically my development piece.
So it is a gospel vision statement. So why don't you tell us what a gospel vision statement is and what its core elements are?
Sure. And so a gospel vision statement, there are a couple of things to remember right from the outset that are going to differentiate it. And one is that it is an internal statement for a congregation that tells it what it's really about as an institution, congregation, school, whatever. And so it's internal. It's actually intended for the people who really participate and are very much a part of helping the institution to go where it
It's
wants.
not the slogan for the front sign.
It is not the slogan for the front sign, that mission statement that we've all been told that we have to have, and that everybody kind of has and puts out there. Those things tend to be really, really general. And they tend to be really welcome, and they actually tend to focus on welcoming everybody because that's what we want to communicate to ourselves and to the world. And that's great as far as it goes, except that the second thing to remember is that actually a gospel vision statement ends up being actually a bit exclusionary. And I know, and you know that I know that it gets really weird when you start talking about the gospel and being exclusionary, except that it's just true that not every institution, not every congregation, not every seminary, not every judicatory actually fits the life of everybody. And there are going to be some people who are going to be happier at, the church down the street for whatever reason than they are at yours. And that's fine.
That's the doing less with less, in action. You don't have to be all things to all people.
That's right. And so what a gospel vision statement asks for are four things, one of which is a sense of mission. And in this case, a sense of mission is about the aspects of transformation, those four transformations that we've talked about, intellectual, psychic, moral, and religious. How is your congregation actually seeking to live those out and to engage those in the world? So it's about transformation. It's a gospel vision statement. It's not just a mission statement.
Strategic plan. It's it is gospel. Right. Okay. Gospel driven.
And it's a good basis for a strategic plan, but it's the reason I use the language of gospel vision statement, which sometimes makes people uncomfortable, but it's supposed to keep right out front that the whole thing is actually about is really about that vision for the gospel, for the transformation that we're trying to build. And so it then asks about the location. So whom are you trying to reach? And commonly that'll be a neighborhood or a city or a couple of townships or something. Online, it may be delineated differently. The location is going to be something of a virtual location. It's not going to be in that way a physical location, but you're going to have to decide whom are you trying to reach? Where are they located? And then so mission, location, identity. Identity is who you are, the core pieces of your self-understanding for today and tomorrow. And if you are a pretty lively, kind of charismatic style congregation with a praise band and whatnot, and that's working for you, that's wonderful. And if that's what's drawing people to you and that's who you are and how you worship, that's great. There's no point in trying to become, a sort of tightly liturgical, congregation with, a big organ and whatever, because that's just not who you are. So you need to decide who you are, and that's part of what will in fact end up being a bit exclusionary. Then there's the resources. So mission, location, identity, resources. And the fun thing about resources is that we're used to thinking of resources as things that we have, our financial resources, our people. I ask us to think about resources to which we have access. So they don't have to be ours. They can come from all sorts of partners, which might be of our denomination, might be of a different denomination, might be of a different religion, might be no religion at all. And that's part of starting to try to think this out beyond denominationalism because frankly, denominations aren't helpful around a lot of this. So it's about how are we going to participate in transformation in the world and whom are we going to reach? And how are we going to reach them and what do we have to make it happen? And the reality is that, by and large, you don't have a gospel call that goes beyond the resources to which you have access. You may have to stretch in terms of getting access to the resources, but basically if the resources aren't there, it's probably not your mission. And one of the risks that we run that leads to all that stress that we've talked about is that we try to we try to draw a vision that is actually far beyond the capacity of our congregation, the capacity, of our financial resources, whatever, so that the resources are actually going to narrow what it is that we can do, just as our identity narrows it and the specificity of the location narrows it. So basically, yeah, I mean, Martha's point about this is another instance of do less with less. Yeah, this is actually about do less with less. This is about focus specifically on the transformation that you're trying to see.
Yeah, and I think that you do a really good job of balancing that leap in faith that ministry always is. Like, there is always a leap in faith with like just very practical assessment of what it is that you actually have to work with, and who you've been historically. Like, if you've historically, been like a tortoise, don't try to market yourself as a stallion, like, right?
Yeah.
Like, just be who you are is also an important part of that. And actually, another message that you say along with do less with less, you say that the message of the book could be like, we're called to be who we're called to be.
Yeah. Know your mission, play within it. One of the more interesting conversations that I've had more than once in work with congregations in the past is, why aren't we a mega church? How can we be, one of those enormous churches like that one down on the freeway where they've got these enormous parking lots, et cetera, et cetera. It's okay. Look, you're a small neighborhood congregation.
Yeah.
You're built around this set of kind of intimate relationships. There's a warmth of support and welcome that comes from you and the kind of ways in which you care for one another. Actually, I can tell you how to turn yourself into a big church, because there's actually some fairly straightforward formula stuff for that. But you know what? That's not what you're called to be. You wouldn't like it. All of you would leave before this place became a big church. Why? Your building doesn't do it. The space doesn't do it. The people who are here don't do it. We would have to change absolutely everything. So, know your mission, play within it. God calls and equips us to do what God calls and equips us to do. We don't have to be all things to all people. We're called to participate in God's transformation in the world, and we're called to be ourselves transformed. And so it's focusing on that message of God's transformation in our lives and in the lives of the world. That's where it's got to be.
Yeah, that's where it's got to be. I want to plug for our listeners that throughout the book, you have questions at the end of every chapter, and you provide ample examples of what a gospel vision statement can look like and how to go about doing that with your community. So it's a book that is really rich in lived experience and theological insight, but it is also kind of a practical workbook for being able to navigate some challenging times. So I think that will be encouraging to people who are feeling those pressure points right now.
Thanks, Martha. That's great to hear. Yeah, my take is very much that it's intended to be as much a workbook as a book that sort of encourages people and welcomes people to think about some of the challenges, because the hope is that you can take this into a place like a congregation and actually sit down with people and help them to begin to think about what the gospel really means for their lives and what it really means for their communities, the people with whom they're working and the places and people whom they're trying to reach, so that they can themselves have a sense that they're understanding God's transformational work in their lives and that they're really engaging with the challenges.
Yeah. We are both people who have the privilege of talking to a lot of people across the Christian church, and there are a lot of places of grief, in letting go of a particular way of being church. There can be a sense of exhaustion, of despair, of failure. Where do you experience God, though? Like, where are you experiencing the energy, the vitality, the hopefulness of God as you're putting this book out there, as you're naming these realities, as you're engaging with real people, doing this real thing? Like, where is the energy and vitality of God showing up in a shrinking church?
So I'm going to tell you, actually, I had the experience just a couple of days ago. So I was chatting with a group in a congregation. I was invited to chat with the congregational council about some of the stuff in my book. And I was given a very short period of time that I was going to be able to do, and they had some planning to do. So I figured, okay, we'll build primarily on planning principles, and we won't spend a lot of time with the transformation stuff. I'll name it and go right by it. In fact, what happened was, I had 30 minutes. We got to the end of the 30 minutes, and people wanted to kind of pursue some questions. Well, by the time we called it a day, we had put in over an hour and 10 minutes, and they just weren't actually going to settle for some basic planning principles. They wanted to get right into this stuff about transformation. They wanted to get right into the issues about what God was about. And I could feel, as I was facing the questions, I could feel, there's a little bit of kind of frustration in the room. People there's some issues here that just aren't getting named. And it was when we actually got deep into the transformation stuff and people began to talk about how this was affecting their lives and how they could actually, begin to communicate and some of those sorts of pieces, that actually the feeling of issues there, that went away, and there was just this sense of excitement. And now, is that, did we change the world? No, we probably didn't. But on the other hand, there was some definite engagement with what God is doing, and that is the kind of thing that resonates. What I'm really noticing, just even inside the church, that constitutes a kind of hope and excitement, is the extent to which people are actually prepared to engage with the gospel in complex and even demanding sorts of ways. The other thing that I'm going to say is that when I chat with people who aren't Christians, they're actually much more interested in talking about what contribution Christianity might make to world transformation than they might have been once upon a time. I know that when I grew up, there was a sort of, you were either Christian or you weren't, and it was all
a bit of hostility. I think.
Yeah. And I don't see the same thing. It's not going to feed our numbers, but it's setting us up for a conversation about transformation. And I think that at least in part, some of the things that are going on politically, some of the things that are going on in just sort of the organization of the Anglosphere these days are actually pushing people to ask deeper questions about what religion might mean and perhaps what Christianity might mean.
Well, I think that's an amazing note to take a break on, because I really relate to that description. I see those sorts of things as well, that curiosity, that engagement, that commitment to really attend to what God is doing inside our churches and in interesting ways outside of our churches. So, yeah, thank you, Bill, for helping us probe your offering here. And again, I just want to make sure before we take our break that people know that the name of the book is Leadership in a Shrinking Church and that they should check it out. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back with some closing questions. Welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast. I am here with the Reverend Dr. Bill Harrison, and we are going to get into our closing questions. So, Bill, we always tell our guests that you are free to take these questions seriously or not. But if you were Pope for a day, how would you fill out those 24 hours?
Okay. The challenge, of course, with being Pope for a day is that you'd hope that you can make some changes that would last. So yeah. I would definitely pick up the synodality conversation that they're having about the ways in which people communicate. But it would also be pushing for some pretty radical changes around things like the ordination of women and welcoming people of different gender and sexual identities. How much that would last beyond the 24 hours is its own question.
Yeah, maybe being Pope for the day, it should be like the genie in the bottle. Your first wish is for a million more wishes. Like your first day as Pope, you could make yourself Pope for the rest of time or something.
Something like that.
Yeah. So you can get that lasting change done. Or, as you said, just work with the synodality of it. That's another method. Is there a theologian or historical Christian figure who you would want to meet, bring back to life, have supper with?
It would absolutely be Bernard Lonergan, who's at the root of a lot of that transformation piece that we've talked about in relation to my book. And I mean, part of the fun stuff, of course, is that he really did come from Canada, born in the Ottawa Valley and spent time in Toronto and in Guelph. He also spent some time in Boston where I did my PhD. So we actually have a lot of places in common. And in fact, we actually have people in common because people like my doctoral director actually sort of knew him. And so we have places and people in common. And I would really like to be able to kind of pick his brain and work deeply into how some of that transformation stuff can play in a contemporary world. That would probably actually play back into being Pope for a day, because I think it would be interesting navigating the Roman Catholic context with some advice and direction from Bernard Lonergan today. Yeah.
Okay. So you can just wrap those two questions into one. Be Pope for the day and have Lonergan at your side.
That would be ideal.
Okay. What will history remember from our current time and place?
I think the biggest piece that history is going to remember is, in fact, irrationality. We're in a time in history where irrationality, as in, sort of a certain kind of opposition to thinking deeply and in complex ways about the future, is not really in vogue. I think that I lean a lot on the conversation about intellectual transformation right at the moment, because it's that one I think distinguishes where a Christian sits in the contemporary conversations. So I think irrationality is going to be the big thing. I hope that we're also going to be able to see some conversation about transformation that will come out of it. But right at the moment, irrationality seems to be the leader.
Yeah, that's a very insightful answer. The last question I feel like we've sort of been talking about throughout our entire conversation, but what are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Yeah, this really is just kind of wrapping up basically what we've been saying. What I would hope for is deeper transformation for all of us, and deeper transformation for the world. It would be deeper intellectual, psychic, moral, and religious transformation. I would love us to be more deeply in love with God and the world, and seeking a deeper understanding of it, seeking a deeper understanding of ourselves, both the way our intellects work and the way our psyches work, and seeking to understand the world so that we can participate in God's transformative work in it. So it would definitely be about deeper transformation.
Well, that is a lovely answer, and it's on brand. So I'm glad that you didn't throw us a major curveball there at the end. Where can people find out more about you, Bill?
Probably the easiest place is to find me on Facebook, just Bill Harrison, or you can find me at Lutheran Theological Seminary, and because those are the places where the information is most up to date.
And how can people get a hold of this book?
It's available through most major online retailers, Indigo, Amazon, various other online retailers, and you can certainly order it through your local Indigo if there's one of those handy to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Bill. Thank you for the book. Thank you for your insights for our future Christian community. We always end with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you, Bill.
Thank you, Martha. And may God's peace also be with you and with the community. Thank you, Martha, for taking time with me, and thank you to those of you who paying attention to the pieces that we've shared today.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.